This podcast is part of the Game and Entertainment Network. Visit tgenetwork.net to find the latest episodes from all our shows.
You're listening to Beyond Boss Fights, gaming conversations with interesting people. And now, here's your host, Raxwolf.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 16 of Beyond Boss Fights. As gamers, we certainly have our share of gripes when it comes to the studios that produce our games. But are there good game studios and bad game studios? Or are they all just companies out to make a quick buck? Today, popular game bloggers and amateur philosophers Murf and Doone speak with me about the ethical responsibilities of game studios, and whether the adherence to ethical practices has any relationship with the ability to produce good games. But before we dive into the deep end, my daughter has a board game to review. Okay, everybody, we have with us Penelope once again. Are we going with Penelope again? Or are we going to do a different name now?
Cupcake Cutie.
Okay, we're going with Cupcake Cutie today. And she's going to answer the question for us. Cupcake Cutie, what are the kids playing?
7 Wonders.
Okay, 7 Wonders. So 7 Wonders is a board game, and we haven't done a board game before. So can you tell me what it is? First of all, tell me how 7 Wonders works. What is it about?
You're trying to build up your city and get points.
Okay, so the idea is there's 3 different ages, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also resources in your city. And you have to get the card that has the resource and say, I'm going to use this card because it gets me this resource, right? And then you can kind of keep building on the resources as the ages progress, right? So like in the second age, you can build something like a stable, but it takes a certain number of resources. And you can either do what? You can have your own resources, or what else can you do?
Buy resources from your neighbor.
Yep, you can trade with your neighbor. You can buy with gold coins from your neighbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the overall objective of the game? You get a certain number of points for...
Resource points?
Well, you get points for certain buildings, give you points, right?
Yeah, and if at the end of each age, this includes their partner again, or your neighbor, you get either a defeat point or a victory point, and
that's for the military stuff, right?
Yeah, and yeah. You get a victory point if you have more than that person, or if that person has more than you, then you get a defeat point.
Yeah, more as far as military points, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you get to the third age and you count up all your points. So what's your favorite thing about this game?
Defeating my brothers.
Does that happen very often?
No.
So what's one thing that you don't like about the game?
Well, my brother's defeating me, which happens a lot. Really just that. My brother's defeating me.
If there was one thing that you could change about the game, what would it be?
Easier to get victory points and never losing. If there's no winners and losers, like other people think.
You don't want to have any winners or losers? You want everybody to win the game at the end? Okay. So this is kind of, I mean, it's not an overly complex game, but it's kind of a complicated game for kids to play. How old do you think kids should be to try and play this game?
By themselves?
Mm-hmm.
10.
10? If you were going to try and convince somebody to play this game, what would you tell them?
you don't have to pay attention if people keep on saying, you lose, you lose, you lose. I win, I win, I win. And
this is starting to sound like a major problem at our house.
Be quiet. and I would tell them that there are these really good cards that you can surprisingly get that you don't know you could. Like in the third age, there was this one card when I was playing, and I had a bunch of resources. And I looked at the side of the card, and it showed me all the resources. I was like, oh, I really want this card. And then I looked down the card, and I was like, I have all these resources. And it's kind of fun when you find out that you have more resources than you think you have.
That's a good surprise, isn't it? Ladies and gentlemen, Penelope Cupcake Cutie reviews 7 Wonders. And today we have with us a couple of fellow bloggers from the blogosphere itself. Murf from Murf Versus is with us. Hey, Murf.
Hey, thank you for having me.
And we also have Doone from XP Chronicles. Hello, Doone.
Hello, Brax. Hello, Murf.
Appreciate you guys both joining me today. And as you know, we like to start out by talking about where you started out in gaming and kind of how you got to where you are today and what you enjoyed doing today. So I guess I'm going to go with Doone first. Doone, would you let us know how you started out gaming?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I never owned a console, but I had a friend who lived on my street who used to invite us all to his garage to play games. And sometimes we'd go to the arcade or things like that, but mostly his garage was the starting point. And then I got my first console when I was 20, and I shared it with roommates, so we bought it together. It was our first apartment. And I actually spent more time gaming on PC for a long time. That's sort of where I come from.
What was your first console?
Nintendo 64.
What are your favorite kinds of games that you play today?
My favorite kind are probably strategy. I love role-playing games. Maybe it's a tie. But strategy games, I have to have them. Definitely my bread and butter.
Cool. What's your favorite game? What's your favorite strategy game?
Civilization.
That's great.
Bravo.
Yeah, that one, the first time I played it, I was blown away. It still blows me away, but these days, that's my go-to strategy. Shadowrun's another good favorite, though.
Cool, very cool. So, Murf, same question for you. Where did you start, and what do you enjoy doing now?
You know, I started very young. I was lucky enough to have an older brother who had a Nintendo. I was still, 5, 6. I found many ways to sneak into his room and play it. And eventually, I got my own system and later moved on to a Super Nintendo and then PlayStation and Dreamcast and PC gaming. I've kind of done it all for pretty much my entire life. It's kind of hard to think of me as a human being without video games in my life.
And so what are your favorite types of games that you play today? I know you kind of go in and out of games, it sounds like, from your blog.
Yeah, I kind of go through big phases. When I was younger, I really loved like my JRPGs, Final Fantasy games, Dragon Warrior, games like that. And I eventually kind of moved into PC more, and then I was getting into BioWare and the Interplay stuff, and then strategy. It's kind of hard to pick a favorite. I mean, I usually go with MMORPGs, RPGs, and shooters. I mean, those are my 3 top games or genres, but that's usually subject to change.
Hey, I've got a question. How about your collection? Like, what proportion of it is shooters or, RPGs or...
You mean like overall? Like,
yeah.
I have a weird habit where I don't keep anything. So as far as like a collection goes, the only thing I have is digital, is Steam, in which case it's mostly Civilization and expansions and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. It's tough to tell, to be honest. I've always just kept a kind of a wide variety of different games and genres I was interested in.
Murph, do you find that you get bored with an entire genre of games, or is it just certain games that burn you out so you've got to move on to something else?
At times, yeah. I have a tendency to see the similarities from one game to the next. So if I stay in genre too long, I get burnt out just on mechanical similarities. I kind of find that I need contrast. And so, I really love RPGs and shooters, but I'm at my best if I'm alternating them or just taking a break from gaming altogether and reading or watching a TV show or anime or something.
I got two of the most philosophical bloggers that I know on because we're going to talk about an interesting thing that could get a little bit deep, I think. It's one of those questions that it's very, very broad. And the question is, are there good and bad game studios? So I wanted to start out kind of by opening up with just a very general, broad question to both of you. Is there such a thing as a good game studio and a bad game studio? And I'm just going to leave it wide open and see what you think.
I don't like the sort of black and white look. I know that might seem contrary, given my style of writing. But are there good and bad studios? Probably. There's definitely good studios. I'm not sure if there are definitely bad studios. I think studios can make bad games, but I don't know if I'm ready to call a studio bad. What do you think, Murph?
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I do think it's an interesting dichotomy to divide between good and bad in this particular case. We also need to kind of clarify what we mean by good, what we mean by bad. Are we talking financially? Are we talking quality of games? I mean, there's a wide variety of issues. But I do agree with you that it's kind of hard to call a game studio bad, per se. I mean, a game studio is just a aggregation of a bunch of human beings trying to produce, presumably, the best product they know how. So I don't want to demonize anyone. But there are definitely some studios out there with some controversial or problematic practices.
So let's qualify good and bad. Are we talking ethics? Are we talking fun games?
And we could go down each of those questions, too. The first one I have here on the list is when you talk about good, the first thing that usually comes to mind, especially if you're just not thinking about it too deep, is does it produce good games? It's a good company because it produces good games. That's kind of the top of the mind. Did any spring to mind as kind of falling into that category?
Yeah. Actually, one very popular studio came to mind that I think embodies what both Murph and I just said, and that's Blizzard. Blizzard makes incredibly polished, finished, wonderful games, but they have a lot of ethical problems in their games. So I think that's a good example of a studio that makes great games, but probably needs to look more at how they're making their games.
Oh, I don't want to agree with you. Oh, I'm cringing at the notion of agreeing that Blizzard makes good games. Objectively, yes, they make good games. I mean, the Metacritic scores are there. The community's there. My blogosphere definitely supports it. My Twitter feeds support it. You, who I respect for your opinions on games, supports them as a good developer. But God, I hate Blizzard. I'm so sorry.
Why do you hate them?
I just can't get into any of their games. They're just the same thing over and over. And it's become progressively worse, as you said, because they do have these issues, especially with how they've become sort of, I won't say focused on monetization, but it's become such a big factor in their games. It's kind of alarming, to say the least, especially since they are so venerated for, being as polished as they are.
Exactly. I think the cult of Blizzard personality speaks more for their quality these days. I agree with you. Their ideas aren't fresh. But what they're good at is building a quality game. If I had an excellent game idea, I would put it in their hands. Like, I know they could make it. It wouldn't have big bugs. It would perform well. It'd be polished. It'd be fun. Like, they could do a good job of making it. But I think their designers suck. I don't think they have good ideas. I think they're pretty unoriginal.
So they're very good at popularizing games too, though, aren't they?
I think part of why they're popularized is the quality. What do you think, Murph?
Probably. I mean, they've got a well-established reputation. They've been making games for a really long time, even though they've made very few. I mean, yeah, I think that's a big factor. I mean, they do come out with some really polished games, but it's hard for me to call that good, though. I mean, it's just a really polished game. It's like if a developer on the App Store came out with a new version of Tic-Tac-Toe, and it's just really pretty, and it never bugged out. It's really polished, but I've played Tic-Tac-Toe before.
Come on, it's not that bad.
That's hyperbole, but come on. It's not that dissimilar.
No, it's not. So, of the Blizzard games, which ones do you two think are the best games? Just like best idea.
The Burning Crusade and the Burning Crusade. I'll give them some credit for Hearthstone. I don't necessarily agree with the monetization of Hearthstone, but that is built in, that's baked in, that's part of the entire tradable card game pie. I mean, that's how those games have always worked. So I can't fault them there. And that's a really polished game that did something that Magic the Gathering really never managed to do. I mean, they've had good online versions of their game, but nothing that's gotten anywhere even near the excitement, the buzz, the following that Blizzard's version has.
Yeah, Hearthstone is kind of a stroke of genius in a lot of ways. I think you hit on a lot of them, Murph, but it also kind of expands the ecosystem that they've created with Warcraft. And it pulls people into that world. And I think that strategically speaking, Blizzard does a lot of things to popularize their games from a marketing standpoint that maybe we don't think of as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Hey, Doone, let me ask you a question. You alluded to some ethical issues that Blizzard has earlier. Would you like to expound on that?
Yeah. So I think at least the past 2 years, players have been more vocal about them. They've got serious issues with their writing, the way they portray race, the way they portray people, gender. World of Warcraft probably gets the worst rap for this, just because it's touched the most lives. So it's representing a much broader culture. So, for example, StarCraft is American through and through. It's got its problems, but it's very clear the culture it's trying to represent. With World of Warcraft, you've got Mists of Pandaria, Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King. And in each of those expansions, Blizzard takes some real-world culture and just completely stereotypes the hell out of them, puts them in game. The Tonka, the Pandarin, even the, what's the wolf race? Can't think of it. Worgen. You name it, they've got the problem. They really just don't even think about it. And I think last summer, Pardo got in trouble for some statements he made about representation in games, but I think what was nice about what he said was it was the truth. Blizzard does not think about this kind of stuff. They just take a culture and just tear it apart. And I think that's very insensitive. I think on an ethical level, that's where they do the worst damage, because they're such a hugely successful game company that the things they do get repeated. So that's why I think it's bad ethics on their part. If they weren't touching so many lives, it would still be bad, but not nearly as bad.
There's a responsibility that comes with being the top dog there.
Exactly. What do you think, Murph?
It's problematic to take that viewpoint, and I don't disagree in the larger sense that I know you're taking. I mean, Blizzard does owe it to the games as a medium, to our culture, to Blizzard's own fans to be representative and be mindful of that representation that they have global, worldwide. I mean, World of Warcraft is a phenomenon that has swept the entire world. I mean, it's everywhere. And so I do agree with your points there, but at the same time, this is a game that has featured an NPC named after Paris Hilton. World of Warcraft, other than the bits of lore that everybody seems to really think is good, is a game filled with nothing but bad puns and jokes and references. It's nothing more than this mass of pop culture distilled into this other form. And I agree. It has racist stereotypes, but those are part of our culture. It's not like they're being specifically disparaging of these groups. I mean, they're not targeting them. It's not like, Blizzard's the new version of, I don't know, the KKK or anything. I mean, they're not a hate group.
Maybe they are.
Let's not go there. But yeah, no, I mean, so it's hard for me. I mean, I agree with your points, but at the same time, I can't take anything about them seriously. So I have to kind of categorize them and put them in these separate categories. And, you know, I know for a lot of people that's problematic because you want your entertainment to be representative and reflect people who are playing it. But at the same time, you know, it's just entertainment. I want it to be able to be what it wants to be. And in this case, it's just a reflection of a bunch of kind of cheesy and outdated stereotypes.
Yeah, but so here's the question. Are you saying that as long as they're copying bad stereotypes from the culture, it's okay? As long as it exists in the culture.
Don't answer that, Murf.
Okay.
It's a trap.
It is a trap. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. One of my favorite anime of all time, G Gundam. It's by far the cheesiest Gundams ever, but it's fantastic because it's also one of the most racist Gundams ever. Because every single Gundam fighter who's participating in this pan-global worldwide tournament to see who gets to run the show or whatever. Don't quote me. I don't remember the plot that well. Every single fighter represents their nation, but it's all done in this shorthand. So you get like, you know, Mexico's represented by the Tequila Gundam, and it's got a sombrero and a poncho. And, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't think anything of it. I mean, I watched this show on Cartoon Network, and I thought it was great. It was fantastic. The action was great, and, you know, Domon Kastu got out there and take this. It was fantastic. And as I've gotten older, I recognize the problems with it, in the way that it does represent people. But I don't want to lose G Gundam just because, you know, it's difficult.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think you have to get rid of stuff like this. I think if they just designed more consciously, it wouldn't be as problematic. So, I mean, what's a game that does that? I can't think of one right now.
You know, the recent news for Overwatch, just sticking with Blizzard, I mean, they are trying to get in some different body types, which is nice. Even though, you know, I did have issues with the new female they get. Finally, we get a muscle-bound, tough female character, but she's, you know, a total Russian stereotype, which is just...
Totally. But I do think, though, I was happy to see that. I felt like they were trying.
Well, if you're going to stick to what Blizzard's already done, like I said, with just being sort of pastiche of all these different sort of stereotypical things, culture, distillation, that sort of stuff, at least you can do is bring in more representative figures, even if they're still stereotypical and probably nationalist at the least.
So here's the thing. You said earlier that Blizzard does have a responsibility. So you agree there?
Broadly speaking, yeah.
Broadly. So what exactly do you give them a pass on then? How do you measure whether they're living up to that responsibility?
It's hard to really put that in objective terms. You know, I think, and this might be more controversial than I like, I think it's up to each individual who's playing the game to decide that. You know, I can't just say objectively that Blizzard gets a pass for this, because there's always the chance that someone will either interpret it as being offensive to them, whether it is or isn't. To them, it may be, and in that case, they don't get a pass. So, you know, it's just how it's perceived by the individual to me.
What's it going to take to kind of break out of that cycle? Because gaming studios, like any other company, are really kind of a copycat industry. They look around, they say, hey, everybody else is doing this and they're fine, they're making money. We're not gonna do anything differently because we don't have to. Is it going to take a market leader like Blizzard to stand up and say, okay, we're going to do things differently? Or is it going to take perhaps a small startup type company to completely break the mold and have wild success doing it? Which is kind of the best way, you think, to break out of this cycle?
So I think both. There will be things that new companies must do just because they're new. They've got a clean slate, and there's a lot they can do to break ground. But I think companies like Blizzard probably have the lion's share because they're the worst. Game companies are going to copy them. That's what the whole capital market thing is about. Copying a good idea to death squeeze all the money out of it. So as far as that's concerned, Blizzard has the greatest responsibility. So I think new studios have a role to play, but I think you need both. You've got to have the big companies spreading good culture, and you have to have the smaller companies, the newer ones, breaking new ground so that culture can thrive.
Think it's possible, Murf?
I agree. It will need to take a top-down and a bottom-up initiative to get things moving. At least if we want things to be better or significantly better within our lifetimes. I think, both sides of the spectrum, the indies, the AAA, are going to have to come together in the middle with something better. We focused out on Blizzard, but, I think BioWare has been a great company as far as trying to get a broader message out, a better representation. I mean, they have their own pitfalls, but, that's a good example of a AAA company trying to, stretch the palette of possible characters from white male to so many other opportunities. And, there's a lot of indies out there that are bringing interesting stories and things from perspectives that, often get lost. So I think we're going in the right direction. I know it's not as fast as many would like. It's certainly not as fast as I would like. I'm dying for better representation of other races, of other cultures, of other genders. I want people to be represented because I want to see those stories. I want to hear those stories. I want to play those stories.
So outside of in-game representation and in-game type of stuff, how about business practices? Are there certain companies that you think of as being maybe a little bit underhanded or being straight up with the consumers, or do you have any perceptions like that?
Get into a comfortable chair. We're going to be here a while.
So, yeah, you said that. Sony just popped into my head. They are terrible. I hate every scheme.
Oh, man.
I think they're so exploitative towards us. We love their stuff.
That's good. I can't help it.
It's so bad.
That's interesting you say that, Doone, because of all the major big game companies, it seems like Sony has been very successful at building a lot of goodwill the last couple of years.
I think their designers are well-intentioned good people. I think their products are sometimes good. It's 50-50 in my experience. But I think their corporate practices as a whole, they're just looking for any opportunity to take a nickel from you. I just hate that sort of pandering for money. And EverQuest Next is the game I'm thinking about right now, and Landmark. I really don't like that $1 billion company funded their alpha and beta testing through gamers. That really leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I don't care what the needs of that company were. I think that was a horrible thing to do.
So let me ask you this question. Are you more forgiving of that type of practice if it's an indie studio rather than a big conglomerate?
No, for me, it's just how much money do you have? If you're an indie studio and you've got $1 billion, you should spend your own money on your own ideas. If you're a big company and you've got $1 billion, you should do the same. So it's a matter of money, not really how you label yourself. If you can afford it, you should finance your own games, just like we're expected to do with our life.
Yeah, I can't necessarily agree with you. I've been a big fan of Kickstarter from the start, and I do agree with your points. I mean, Landmark's paid alpha, outrageous. The paid alpha for, H1Z1? Stupid name, I always forget it.
Yeah, it's stupid.
Those are horrendous, because like you said, I mean, this is a major company. It's not like I'm just going to keep referring to him as SOE because I'm not going to bother with Daybreak. But it's not like SOE just appeared out of nowhere. They have one of the longest standing histories in the MMORPG genre. For them to come out and say, hey, we need your money for this game. It's going to be free to play. So we just want your money up front, even though you may or may not give it. That's outrageous. But the idea of a paid alpha for an indie studio, to me, is fantastic. It's awesome. It's worked out so well for several games. I won't say so many, but for several games. Besiege is a good example. I mean, that's a fantastic game that may or may not exist because we have the infrastructure in place now for these things to happen. I mean, if you really have to rally against anything, it has to be the big AAA publishers who've left behind the middle market altogether to make new Call of Duties or new Assassin's Creeds or does Ubisoft have any other games? I think I think that's it. Well, Splinter Cell a few years ago, they finally stopped making those.
I'm not against crowdfunding, but I think we all know when companies abuse things like that. As far as the ethics of sort of, what makes a good or bad company when it comes to Kickstarter, again, you should fund your own ideas as much as possible. Players like us don't mind pitching in. We enjoy it, actually. And I just wrote a piece about, the Kickstarter ethos. It's about that. It's about players getting together with their creators and having the journey together. That's wonderful. So I agree, but I think there's a lot of room for abuse, and I think it gets abused. I think Sony, we both agree, they shouldn't have done that. It was terrible. I think that's abusive. And I don't care if your game will not get made. If it requires you to abuse us in that way, I don't want to play it. I'd rather you didn't get released.
That's fair.
How about on the flip side of things? How about companies that seem to treat their customers well?
Well, my favorite up until Destiny was Bungie. Destiny kind of ruined it for me, but everything about Halo, even though it was backed by the conglomerate Microsoft, who aren't usually anyone's favorite when it comes to treating their customers, fairly. There's something just charming. One of the hallmarks of a studio that I consider good is one that is open with its fans, that is frequently communicating, even if they don't have anything to sell you. And that was something that Bungie always did especially well. They had this identity. Now, given it was usually puns or something related to the number 7, a lot, but it worked. They had this personality. It was fantastic. They had a weekly address, and even if I wasn't playing a Halo game at the time, it was something interesting for me to read because it was usually about the company politics or philosophy or about a future project or an old project. It really brought things together. And they also had, like Bungie Day, which how many developers have their own holiday? I mean, they gave levels away on that day. Well, BlizzCon will charge you an arm and a leg to see it. So Bungie still has the upper hand. I mean, they've given levels away in Halo on Bungie Day, themes and other knickknacks that no one really cares about, but it's still awesome.
I think actually Blizzard is an example to follow when it comes to engaging with and treating your players well. I hate to give them that point, but they treat their players really well. I thought their support was pretty much the gold standard.
I'm perhaps biased.
Well,
I know it's a little late since we talked about Blizzard so much. I'm perhaps biased against Blizzard, and I have one issue that has probably shaped my entire outlook on them as being if not greedy, a company that's quick to take $1 from you if they see your pockets open and
what is it?
While it's hanging out. Yeah, that's every company. But, with Blizzard, when I was wanting to play Diablo 2, I waited a really long time. I didn't get it when it first came out. I got it, later on when it was boxed up with the expansion and the strategy guide. And it still cost as much as the game used to. It never went down in price. It's insane.
Okay. So I'll give you that point. The prices are ridiculous with Blizzard, but they do take care of you.
That's fair.
To give an example we can both get behind, how about Harebrained Studios? I think actually they're exemplary for their Kickstarter and the way they engage with their players. I don't think they've done as much as Bungie, but give them time. I think they will.
Yeah,
and that's the studio behind Shadowrun. I'm sorry.
There's especially with Kickstarter from my own personal experience. I've backed a lot of games on there. Pillars of Eternity just came out, so that's a big one. Shovel Knight's probably my all-time favorite Kickstarter game so far. And it's just, sometimes they can be a little manipulative. I completely agree that this is an emerging market that definitely needs some regulation and oversight and players to be a little more insightful into the process itself. And Kickstarter as a company really owes it to both the project starters and the backers to really be willing to step in a little more often. But all that aside, I absolutely love Kickstarter just because as these games are being developed, I'm getting constant updates and feedback. And it's not just the marketing, my publisher told me to write this kind of stuff. It's the real stuff. You got pictures of the team. You got the game in whatever state, however ugly it may be. They don't care. They know you already spent your money, so they'll show you how the game's going to be. Because they know, in most cases, it's going to look better in time. So it's fun to see the raw process and the passion of developers that I think gets lost more often than not, especially with these AAA studios who have all the lawyers and every other thing ready to kind of write their message for them.
So we were talking about ethics. What about, I'm just going to throw this out there because it's not like it's that far-fetched. What about the company that kickstarts and gets a bunch of people to, and I'm not going to say invest, to give their money to the project, and then they change the project?
So I think that's not necessarily, I guess it depends on how much change we're talking about. If people have put money into one idea, and you totally shift gears on the idea, it depends on the relationship you have with them. If I support a project and they change the project, depending on how well they've been communicating with me up until that point, I might not care. I might continue to support them. As an ethical boundary, I think you gotta be careful. Because part of the problem with Kickstarter is the idea that if you do something like that as a creator, you don't owe your supporters anything. This idea that you are not responsible, that people are just throwing their money at you and no promises. It might get something out of it. They might not. That's terrible. So I think you have to get, some promises and assurances from creators, but it's not bad offhand, I don't think. I think it just depends on the relationship between them and their supporters.
Peter Molyneux.
I knew he was going to come up. I was leaving that alone, but
well, this is tailor made for Peter Molyneux, and was it Goddess? I'll say Goddess. Yeah, that's a game that promised so much, and it's taking so long, and he's just been distracted every which way from making the game he promised. And it's not necessarily, a question of over-promising. I think his reputation is set in stone enough that people are aware, even on Kickstarter, that he over-promises. So I don't think it's really that question.
I hope when I'm 50, I'm not making the same idiot mistakes I was when I was 30. And that's sort of how I look at Peter.
I would hope that, in the process of growing older, you do change.
Yeah.
Especially the bad parts. I forget the specific game example, but there was another story I heard not that long ago. It was a small time indie game on Kickstarter, maybe 100, 200,000, not the $1 million stuff. Maybe even less than that. It had the pixel art, so, everybody's clamoring, gotta have the pixel art. And the developer, halfway through decided, you know what? I'm not really into this game. I'm going to make a different game. And you're welcome to kickstart that.
idea.
It's stuff like that drives you absolutely insane. That's not just an ethical issue and sort of a corporate speak ethics. That's a human being ethical issue. That's I'm taking money from someone and giving them absolutely nothing in return. And, that's just fundamentally bad.
There are a lot of people defending it. Saying, oh, it's Kickstarter, what did you expect? Oh, you're a bunch of whiners if you complain about it. So there's a pretty vocal, I hope, minority who disagree with us on that.
There are also people who like economics in the rational sense. I tend toward the behavioral stuff. I know we've had brief discussions of this in the past, dude. And so to me, it's a different set of principles that you're judging here. When people try to say Kickstarter is fine, this is, what you expect, like you said, that's looking at it from this completely rational sense. But when someone gives someone else money, there's an emotional aspect there. It's not just purely, oh, I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to get X in return. I mean, Kickstarter, yeah, I mean, it has promises, but it's in that particular case, he just walked away. It's not like he ran out of money or had some real life issues. I mean, those things happen. They've happened for games before, and those, I think, are legitimate excuses for Kickstarter. Even though I do, like I said earlier, Kickstarter does have some responsibility. They should be able to step in here and at least give some money back, if not all, at least something. But I still feel like it's two different, metrics that we're judging. So yeah, I agree. There's been projects I've supported on Kickstarter that have completely failed. And I agree in the sense that, as far as the business aspect of it, I put in my money. It didn't pan out. I lost my money. Boo-hoo. But that, to dismiss the entire other element, it just seems fundamentally faulty to me. I mean, there's a huge emotional attachment, especially to these video game projects, which often already play on nostalgia to even get you interested in the first place. So for that to just fail or walk away, or it's just, I don't know. I have issues excusing that. And I would hope that people who excuse Kickstarter on the rational business side can see that point of view.
A couple weeks ago, an ex-Turbine developer showed up in an unofficial forum and started talking all about the glory days of the company when he worked there. And one of the things that he said was that there was just this attitude at Turbine or this suspicion at Turbine, let's put it that way, that Blizzard was a lot of times not only was Blizzard producing games and doing great with their games, but they were also playing defense. They were doing some things that you could maybe, some people might say are strategically intelligent, and some people might say they're actually kind of ethically low. If they found out that Turbine was going to release an update to a game on a certain date, they would release something the day before or something like that. And so when you hear things like that, when you hear about some of the nastiness between game companies, does that affect your perception of that company at all, or is it mostly just the way they treat their customers?
Yeah, it definitely affects it. Also, I want to say, I believe those allegations. I think Blizzard events are too well-timed. And when I hear stories about it, it reminds me all the time that Mike Morhaime is an avid poker player. So I don't think those are coincidences. I just don't. I think they do that. The guy at Turbine might have been onto something. But I think it does change how I look at them. So I'm not a Blizzard fan. I wouldn't say that. I just give them credit where it's due. It's true I've loved almost all of their games in the past, but the past 5 years have been extremely, alienating. I don't like what they're doing at all. So hearing things like that just makes it worse for me. I think even less of them.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think this also kind of points to a greater issue and it's sort of a core problem with games as we see them right now, in that, I want to look at Blizzard as the studio that makes games that I either enjoy or don't enjoy. I don't really care about the business side. And when that enters into it, and when I have to start considering these companies as companies and not just, for lack of a better word, artists making, art, it takes me out of it. I have to start examining Blizzard as, like you said, this ruthless, almost, Steve Jobs Apple-like entity that is willing to do whatever it can to kind of block other people from, freely entering into the market and doing their best thing. Now, I mean, it does make perfect business sense. I can't fault Blizzard for that, especially as someone who likes games, likes strategy. I mean, that's perfect strategy, but it just seems wrong to me. I mean, just make good games and stop trying to, beat the other guy in these, little, I don't know, underhanded kind of ways.
That's what's unethical about it. It's this idea that there's a way to run business, and as long as that's legal, as long as we meet those standards, we don't have to worry about morality. I think almost every game company takes that position, that creativity is king, and ethics is somewhere extremely low on the list. And I think only recently Are we seeing developers being called on it and turning around on that position? I think most have sort of made their careers on the idea that if it's good for business, it's good, right? And the business, the success of the business will determine whether it was a good thing to do. I think Blizzard does terrible with that. You were saying earlier how they, the prices of their games. Just look at the pet shop and wow, that is extortion.
And many pets are stupid. Come on, people.
But why are they still collecting a subscription on this ancient game?
You might want to edit that out. People will burn my blog down.
We're keeping that. I think they do terrible.
So let me go back to something you said earlier, Murf. Is it difficult as a games blogger to separate the business from the game? Because it seems like every month we've got news about some kind of layoff or another, and it's not like you can escape that news if you're paying any attention at all to the games industry.
It's impossible. And the reason I say it's impossible is because as a blogger, especially one who doesn't make any money doing this, it's not my job, it's just something I enjoy doing. I write with passion in mind. So it's topics I'm interested in. And there's nothing that gets my interest more than things that make me angry. And these things make me angry. We haven't even mentioned Electronic Arts and seeing, Max's close or, Origin before them or any of the other many, many studios. I hate that because they don't need to close in the sense that, they're still making good stuff or they still could have made good stuff. I know why it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. It's rational. It's business at its best. That's what you do. But at the same time, EA, please let Bullfrog Games out from your vault. You're not Disney. Please. I need updated versions. Have you tried to, thank you, GOG. I love you, GOG. I'm glad you exist. But I don't want to play games in DOSBox anymore.
I think you're right. As far as that question, I think the first idea that came to mind was how this change in the culture we're seeing, this is part of the great importance of it, to sort of change the way we think about good business practices. And I think today more companies are trying to align their morals with their practices. I think it's been customary for businesses to be amoral, to not even touch the ethics question, please the shareholders, pass out the checks. That's what's good for business. But I think now, to close a company more and more, people are seeing that as terrible and they're getting angry. So I think it's a good opportunity for the cultural change we need to happen. And I hope, 5 years from now even, that shutting down a studio will be so frowned upon that these huge companies will stop buying the smaller ones. I think when we start seeing that, we'll actually start seeing the culture change.
It would be nice for publishers to publish instead of publish what they develop.
Yeah, that's a huge problem.
Lately I've been working on a future blog project, and it's got a bit of an autobiographical thing, and it's got this sort of historical kick, and I've been thinking a lot about my life as a person who loves video games. And it's so fascinating to me that monetization in video games has been this huge topic in the last couple of years that, in the past, I don't know if we even really thought about it that much. I know it's been an issue at different times. You had shareware and freeware and all that sort of stuff, but it's crazy how if you talk about video games now, you have to talk about monetization. It's built into how these games are made now with free-to-play. It's built into how these games are funded with paid alphas and Kickstarter. And that goes from the bottom, from the indie games, to the very top, to the AAA.
I think you made a good point earlier about trading card games like Magic. In a sense, games like that have always been monetized, but I never saw this coming. I didn't think this would happen, where every game is sort of trying to get in on that.
Every single game. Does every game need a DLC season pass and skins on top of it? Evolve is insane. The amount of things you can spend. And I get it. Personal responsibility. Everyone has the right to not spend their own money. But at some point, when do I have the right to not be harassed by your market when I just want to play a fun game that I've paid for and not have all these extra things constantly in my face?
And it kind of goes back to the copycat type of business that we were talking about before, because at some point you no longer have the choice. If everybody's monetizing the same way, then all of a sudden you can't say I'm going to pay once and play anymore because nobody's offering that.
So you mean like buying a box as opposed to paying these micro fees?
Or the DLC season pass or something like that. To me, DLC season pass is nothing more than here, I'm going to pay you a year's worth of subscription up front.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. I think the incident a couple of years ago with Mass Effect, the day one DLC, Mass Effect 3 came out, and there were parts of the game that they took out in order to sell it later as a DLC on the first day. And of course, gamers went wild over that, rightfully. I think stuff like that is what people... when you say, I want to just pay my money and play my game and be left alone, that's the kind of thing that pisses us off. I don't think gamers are asking too much at all.
Let me throw a thought out there, and I want you to tell me how absurd do you think it is. Okay, here you go. A MOBA, like League of Legends, Dota 2, Smites, Heroes of the Storm, that isn't free to play. I don't think that it could ever exist.
I'm trying to think if it can. I think there's a way to do it. It'd be an extremely unpopular game.
No one would play it, and it's a game that's built on community. So,
well, yeah, that's kind of one of those things that it's the cat's already out of the bag on that one. You can't compete with a free to play League of Legends with a with a clone or another MOBA that you have to pay for.
And that's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, games like League of Legends can have the huge market share, the huge communities they have on the backs of their free-to-play monetization. But at the same time, that's an entire style of game, this multiplayer-focused game, where you just pay and you're done, and then you compete and play over and over. That just is not going to happen anymore. I mean, even the new Unreal Tournament's going to be free. Fighting games are I think Killer Instinct's model is pretty good. I like it, but it is a free-to-play model. I don't see that as being something that's going to go away.
So I'm going to try and put a little bit more of a positive spin on things again.
Please.
Can you think of a time when a game studio did something and you just really sat back and you thought, oh, that was really nice. I wasn't expecting that. Something besides here's a free item in game, something like bigger, something that you went, I just did not see that coming.
So recently, it's not a game company per se, but you guys are familiar with Gen Con?
Mm-hmm.
So in Indiana, they're passing a law that would allow religions to discriminate against homosexuals. And Gen Con has started this cascading effect by telling the state of Indiana that they will take Gen Con out of the state if the mayor, or the governor signs it into law. I think when I heard that, I was thinking the entire time, this is how you do it, people. When you need things to change in a big way, you have power. You can shut down your convention. You can move your game somewhere else. You can find other players. And I haven't seen a studio do anything quite like that, but I think that's the kind of action that, makes me feel like maybe things are going to get better. You know what another one is recently? Sorry to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I think it's Rust. It's the open world survival game. Recently, they changed the races to be randomized, and players are totally not wanting to be black. I think that's a bold move.
I don't know enough about the game. How does that, is the game randomized in a way? Is that like part of the character creation process?
So there's no character creation process. There never has been. The game's been early access in open beta. So all the characters in game up until that day were white males. Mm-hmm. Nobody batted an eye about customizing their characters. None of that. As soon as they announced that every character will now have a randomized skin tone, all the tears in the world. They're just falling out of the eyeballs. People are gnashing their teeth. Like, I don't think there could be a bigger example of what people mean when they say there's racism in the gaming community. And they're doing it because, for design reasons, it's actually not a social justice thing. They like the idea of players having a truly unique identity, and they feel like they can better achieve that with randomization.
But they've got a fascinating social experiment on their hands now.
Totally. I hope they stick with it, because I think what they're witnessing and what the rest of us are seeing from the outside is what everybody's been denying happens in the game community. That there's no racism, that there's no sexism, that it's not overt, that, gamers are saying, we're insane. We're insane. I think people up until now are seeing it is true that most of us are white dudes. And that's why we didn't care that all the characters in the game before were white dudes who all looked exactly alike. And now that they're getting a different skin color, nobody wants to play a dude. So I think this is an awesome experiment.
I couldn't really think of any examples on my own. The closest I get, and it's not even a big deal. It's just anytime a game comes out and it's not full price and not like a marketing kind of thing. It's just like City Skylines came out recently, and that's a pretty good game. It's really, it's a solid game. It's $29.99. And I know it's a smaller studio. It's sort of in between indie and a little more established, but it wasn't kickstarted. It wasn't anything like that. But just seeing a game come out and not be $59.99, here, give me all your money and give me the season pass, and here's our cash shop, and we're going to have a sequel next year. It's refreshing just to see that much going on.
And it wasn't early access.
That's true. It's true. It wasn't even early access. It's just, here's the complete game. And, knowing what's Paradox Interactive? I mean, they actually, as far as I can tell, I haven't played that many of their games in real time. I usually come back and forth to them every now and then. They do a pretty good job of following up on their stuff too, not having to charge you. So, it's a good example of a company that's not, gotten greedy.
Kind of going back to the very first question that we talked about, producing good games, do you guys think that is there a relationship between the way a studio does things and the quality of the games that they produce? Or is that just kind of a fallacy and a association that we make in our minds when we hear the way a company operates?
I want to say there's definitely a relationship there, but I don't know the inner workings of that many companies to really make up my mind about that. I think for the companies I know, there seems to be a relationship. I mentioned Harebrained Studios earlier, the developers behind Shadowrun Returns. There's a clear correlation between how they funded their game, how they interact with us, the quality of the game itself, the quality of each iteration. Like, those things are clearly all related. It's not just having technical skill. It's engaging with your players. And I think that makes any game better. And I don't mean engage in the sense of do what your players tell you to do, but just sort of, being in the community, knowing how they're feeling, listening to what they like about your game, and sort of being able to still surprise them. You know what they want, and maybe you won't give them that, but you understand their needs enough to bring them something fresh and fun anyway. So I think there's a relationship in my experience.
Yeah, I agree. And just to kind of come back full circle to my Bungie examples from earlier, that's a studio that as soon as they got out from under Microsoft, they immediately got into bed with Activision. They signed an absolutely staggeringly huge contract to make a series of pseudo MMOs. I believe they doubled their team size. So they're a huge company. Just before Destiny came out, they kind of they're like a Marty O'Donnell's, who's, make the Halo theme, which is, a classic video game theme at this point. I know it's kind of weird to say that but Halo's been out a long time. So, and to see them do all of that and then come out with Destiny, a game that has been almost universally panned, that hasn't really had the same love and passion that any of the Halo games had. And this is coming from someone who bought an Xbox 360 twice. to play Halo games. And to see Destiny be what it is, and as you said, a company that's capable of listening, and that was kind of the hallmark of Bungie, is they had their finger on the pulse of their community. But with this new game, I mean, they struggled at every turn. I mean, there's no matchmaking for rating, something that people have been asking for. More and more players of Destiny who have persevered through the horrible, horrible game that it is, I know that's pure opinion, have found outside ways to do these things. They started websites. And when your players have to start websites to meet one another within your pseudo MMO, it's not the late 90s, early 2000s anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's time you listen. And given they're moving on it a little bit slowly, but it's not the Bungie I remember. And so when you ask this question, I think there's definitely something to it. Because to me, and it's just one example. It's hardly a great sample size, but it's a company who more or less have sold out, and their game has suffered for it. And I know it's funny saying Bungie sold out because they left Microsoft. And I always like a good Microsoft dude.
I know, Murf, you mentioned Dragon Age earlier. I wanted to say that I think they do a pretty good job, but I think it's because they go out of their way to push boundaries. Like, that's part of their design. So I think as far as the last question, that's another studio that pushes the boundaries consciously.
And, just to tie that back, Jade Empire is one of my favorite BioWare games. I'm actually not a big fan of Mass Effect and Dragon Age. They're okay. But my big loves are Jade Empire and Knights of the Old Republic and the Baldur's Gate games. And Jade Empire is an interesting game when you look at it in comparison to Mist of Pandaria, which is basically what Kung Fu Panda run amok. I mean, it's huge stereotypes everywhere. Jade Empire takes the same culture and, even though they do different things and they repurpose it, and it's still a game about Kung Fu, which might be slightly problematic, it still seems respectful and loving, and it takes the culture, and it introduced me to so many different mythological ideas, religious ideas from Asian cultures that I was completely unaware of it up until the point I played it. So BioWare has, for their entire history, been a studio, like you said, willing to push the envelope, at least to some extent, and tell some really good stories that I think include, players from different backgrounds, different genders, different walks of life, fairly.
Yeah, they do a generally really good job. There's lots of room for improvement. There always is, though. So I don't criticize them too hard, but they do a good job. And I think that's what it takes. Just be willing to do something different for your players. Just be willing. It's literally all it takes. But don't take this position that our games are just like this, and that's just the way it is, and, we're gonna do us. Fine, there's a market for that, but don't expect people to respect you for it.
Really just a couple of things I wanted to mention before we got into the feedback section of the show. And they're all TGen related, the Gaming and Entertainment Network. First of all, I'm very excited to be able to say that we have taken on not one but two new fantastic podcasts into the Gaming and Entertainment Network. The first one's a gaming podcast. It's Multiplaying. Multiplaying is not only a podcast, but it's also a community at multiplaying.net. They've got forums, they've got guilds that go with this community, and so the podcast was kind of an extension of this community that they built, and it's a really cool thing that they've got going over there. We thought that their promotion and their strive towards building community really fit into what TGen is trying to do as well, so we were really excited when they accepted the invitation to join the network. The other one is our very first podcast dedicated to the history of filmmaking called How Is This Movie? And this is done by Dana, is the host name, and he does a really, really good job telling the history of a specific movie in each episode and how it came to be and some of the little trivial things about it that you might not have known. And it's really a fun listen. So I think if you have any interest in pop culture or films at all, you're really going to enjoy How Is This Movie? So please check those two things out. Our featured TGen show this month is Battle Bards, which we've talked about before, is a very unique podcast in that it's, we think, the only MMO music based podcast out there. It's done by Steph, Sil, and Sip. Two of those bards have been guests on this podcast. And I'm not going to take any more time away from Sil. I'll just let her tell you all about it.
Hello everybody, this is Sil from the BattleBards podcast. The BattleBards believe that there's two kinds of players in the world. Those who already love video game music, and those that will after listening to our show. BattleBards is the world's first and only dedicated MMO music podcast, and you can find us over at battlebards.libsyn.com, where we discuss and rate soundtracks on a bi-weekly basis. See you there, and thanks for supporting the TGEN network.
And as for feedback, we don't have any feedback this month. So if you've got some, you can always send it to my email address at braxwolf@gmail.com, and I'll read it on the podcast. Remember that Beyond Boss Fights is also on iTunes, and would appreciate your ratings and reviews. Helps other people find the podcast, and, makes me feel good. Beyond Boss Fights is also on Stitcher and Player FM, so add it to your playlists there as well. Murf, thanks for being with me. Would you mind giving out your contact information for the listeners?
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. You can find me at murfversus.net. That's MURFVS.net. Or on Twitter at CTMurphy. Again, I hate the PH, so it's CTMURFY.
Doone, thank you for being with us as well. And how can people get a hold of you if they'd like to?
It's been awesome. Love talking with you guys. You can find me on Twitter at TRRedSkies. All one word. And xpchronicles.com.
And as for me, you can follow me on Twitter at Braxwolf. That's BRAXWOLF. You can email me at braxwolf@gmail.com. You can find me on Anook, Facebook, and YouTube. And you can always visit my blog at braxwolf.com. Thanks. See you next time.